before we wrap things up, I want to talk about one last thing. Here I'm going to give you a few tips to help you better organize your process when writing and building an Arduino project with object-oriented programming. And those tips directly come from my own experience. So the first tip, and I actually talked about that before, is to always have a goal in mind, something you want to achieve with your program. This way, you can write the code you need and not waste time writing huge parts of code that you are not going to use, and worst, that you are probably going to need to write again in the future because it simply won't solve the problems you want to solve. Then, with Arduino, you can think of two kinds of classes: the ones that abstract a hardware component and the ones that abstract a functionality or a process. For example, you could have a class for an LED, a class for a motor, a sensor, etc. And you can have a class for a functionality like a traffic light or a controller which will measure some input from sensors and accordingly give commands to other actuators. And then when you start to write the classes, well, start with the most low-level class. In the traffic light example, you could see that we first started with the LED class, to then go to the LED blinker class, and finally implementing the traffic light class. So what you can do here is to try to draw the architecture of your program to see what you need to implement first. Note that the architecture doesn't need to be complete, and it is probably not the final one. When you write code, you will realize that things are maybe better in another way, and you will adapt the architecture along the way. No problem with that. Actually, that's what I did when I wrote the course project myself for the first time. I changed the architecture a few times before arriving to the final one. The important thing here is that you have something to get started with. And finally, when you actually write one specific class, just do the minimum you need to do so you can test your code and see a real result. It is much easier to start with something small that works as expected and then iterate than trying to write the entire class directly and then realize that you have a lot of bugs and functionalities that are not really what you need. So build a minimal working code first, then add functionalities one by one and test between each iteration. Make everything step by step, each step being as small as possible. Think of building your code as building a house. You are going to build each functionality as a small brick. And then once you have a lot of bricks, you can assemble them to create an even bigger structure, add more small bricks on top of that, etc., etc.